Our second reading for today comes from Romans 8, verses 18 through 25. The Apostle Paul says, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its enslavement to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together as it suffers together the pains of labor, and not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what one already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So in Psalm 130, David wrote a prayer to God. But what kind of prayer was it? Emma, one of our confirmation students, is here, and she'll remind you that we already talked about 4 different kinds of prayer: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication, or in more childlike terms, wow, oops, thanks, and gimme. So which of these types of prayer describes Psalm 130? Well, it certainly seems like David is asking God for something in verses 1 and 2. "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications." Well, there, it's right there. It's a prayer of supplication. It says so right there in verse 2. This prayer is a gimme. And yet the very next verse makes it sound more like a prayer of confession. "If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, so that you may be revered." So maybe this is an oops prayer. And yet even with prayers of confession, we're still asking God for something. We're asking God for mercy and forgiveness. Every prayer of confession is also a prayer of supplication. Even while we're saying oops, we're still asking God to give it. But rather than those words, mercy or forgiveness, David ends up asking for something a little different in the last 2 verses. "O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is great power to redeem. It is he who will redeem Israel from all its iniquities." David is asking God to redeem him and to redeem all of Israel. That redemption, in this case, is the ancient word for the price for someone's freedom. If someone pays the price for a slave so that that slave can be free, they have redeemed that slave. If someone pays a ransom to kidnappers to release their hostage, they have redeemed that person from their captors. David is praying to God to save them from their own sins, to release them from the prison that sin has put them in. And finally, David adds one more special word to this prayer: hope. "I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I hope. O Israel, hope in the Lord." So David is waiting, and he's hoping. But what's the difference between those two, waiting and hoping? Well, all of us should know what it means to hope for something, but in the Bible, there's a spiritual significance to that word, hope. To hope in the Lord means that our waiting is based on our faith in God. What we're waiting for is something that God has promised to us, and that is why we continue to wait. And in this case, David has based this prayer on his faith in God's promise. God has already promised to offer mercy to everyone who comes before God in humble confession. Having experienced God's faithfulness in all of God's other promises beforehand, David is hoping that God will fulfill that promise of redemption too. David confesses his iniquities and those of his nation, and now David waits, but he waits with hope. Which brings us to Romans. I know this is a hard scripture to understand. I know that the Apostle Paul is trying to pack a whole lot of theology into one paragraph. And I know it's confusing when he uses poetic terms like creation and children of God, which can be interpreted in a whole lot of different ways. But for today's purposes, I want to give you a more modern, more accessible version of what Paul may have been talking about. Who here has seen an advertisement showing before and after examples? Before and after photos. Maybe it's an ad for a diet pill, showing a depressed-looking fat person in one photo. And then in the next photo, they've been transformed into a happier, thinner person because they took the product and it worked. I know it's hard to look thin while I'm wearing a robe, so just pretend I'm wearing a bikini. Okay, don't do that. Don't imagine. Whatever you're doing, do not imagine that I'm wearing a bikini. Okay, stop it. I think to Paul, creation and the children of God are the before and after photos. Creation means people who had not received redemption from God. Paul says they were subjected to futility because they were in bondage to death and decay. They were still prisoners of their own sin and their own mortality. Without God's redemption, there was nothing at the end of their story except an ending. And that's it. But they were waiting. They were waiting for that redemption. Paul says that they were waiting for it like a woman in labor, waiting to give birth. And then Paul shows us the after picture, his description of the children of God. Paul says that these are the people who, like everyone else, were living in the prison of their own sin and under the threat of the end of their lives. They had heard God's promise of redemption. They'd heard God's promise of a Redeemer. And having heard that promise, these people waited. But their faith in God and in God's faithfulness, their faith in God's willingness to fulfill promises, allowed them to wait with what? Hope. And finally, in Jesus Christ, that promise that they had hoped for was fulfilled. Through Jesus Christ, God did redeem them. God did pay the price to release them from slavery to sin. God did break the chains of death so that instead of just oblivion, these people now adopted into the family of God could look forward to what? Glory, Paul says. Paul says that glory is waiting for all of us. David's prayer all the way back in Psalm 130, that prayer of supplication for God's redemption, David had prayed for redemption. He had waited for it and had hoped for it. Not just for himself, but for all of Israel, for all of God's people. And finally, in Jesus Christ, that prayer had been fulfilled. So how about us? The redeemed people, the children of God. Are we still waiting for something? Yes. Paul says that none of us are going to see the true, final fulfillment of God's promise until a few seconds after our hearts stop beating. We're going to have to wait to experience that particular glory for ourselves. But God has fulfilled all of God's promises so far, and because of that, all of the children of God, all of us, can hope for what we haven't seen yet. And we can wait for that glorious fulfillment, that final redemption, with patience. But the question I want to ask is, can we apply that to the other things that we are waiting for in our lives? Because I know all of us are waiting for something. What are we waiting for? What are we hoping for? What are we trying to be patient about? Are we waiting for our health to improve? Are we waiting for our jobs to get better, or maybe for an entirely new job? Are we waiting for a relationship in our lives, a new one, or maybe an improvement to an old one? Are we waiting for politicians to fulfill their promises? You may have a long way to head. I'd bring a book if I were you. Are we waiting for something in our lives to begin? Are we waiting for something in our lives to end? For all these things we can wait. We can try to be patient. We can even hope for any of these things. But part of what David and Paul are telling us is that true spiritual hope isn't based just on what we want or what we think should happen. The hope that gives us that spiritual fruit of patience is based on God's promises. Because yes, God is faithful. What God has promised to give us is going to come to pass. But we have to know what those promises are. So if you're waiting for something, do you want to be able to wait with hope? True spiritual hope. If that's the case, I invite you to take some time to read your Bible, to come to church and talk with the other Christians in your lives that you trust, to pray about it, to learn as much as you can about what God has promised and to learn how God has fulfilled the promises God has made. And then look at what you are waiting for in your own life. If everything that you have learned tells you that you're waiting for something that God has promised to you, that is when you can wait with true spiritual hope. I want to finish going back to Psalm 130 with one warning and one assurance. In Psalm 130, David does something strange. He repeats himself. As far as our modern interpretations can tell us, David finishes verse 6 by repeating himself word for word. My soul waits for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning. More than those who watch for the morning. Why? Why would David do that in his prayer? Well, I can think of a couple of different reasons. First of all, because what we're waiting for may take more than just one morning. Maybe a lot of mornings. David prayed for his redemption and for the redemption of an entire nation, for all of God's people. But our redemption in Jesus Christ, that didn't occur until about 1,000 years after David wrote those words. That's a long time to wait. If my math is correct, that's around 365,000 mornings. But what else do we know about waiting for the morning? Our waiting always comes to an end, because morning always comes. Even as he prays for something as abstract and hard to define as God's redemption, David is so faithful, so assured of God's fulfilling God's promises, that David says that redemption is as sure as the sun rising. It will come. It is going to happen. So when we're waiting for something in our own lives, when we are waiting for God to fulfill God's promises to us, we can wait with patience. We can hope. Because when we know God, we know that God is a God who makes promises and fulfills them. We may have to wait. But we can wait with hope even when we can't see what we're waiting for. And with that hope, we can wait with patience. Let God's people all say, amen. Friends, will you please rise and join together in our affirmation of faith.